last hour of today's content. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And John, if you want to go ahead and start sharing yours while I read your introduction. All right. So next up, we have John Dewees of University of Rochester presenting Connecting Metadata and Digital Assets, ArchivesSpace and Preservica. Bringing together a metadata management system like ArchivesSpace and a digital asset management system like Preservica so that they can communicate with each other can be a complicated process. This presentation will discuss how the University of Rochester developed their workflow to create digital objects within ArchivesSpace efficiently at scale, as well as provide access to the digital surrogates or born digital assets that researchers want to access. Take it away, John.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. My name is John Dewees, and I'm the Senior DAM Specialist at the University of Rochester. And today we're here to talk about workflows for connecting ArchivesSpace with the digital asset management system, Preservica. Also, through all of my timings of this presentation, we should have like oodles of time at the end for questions, so please feel free to kind of get those ready. So the goal here is to rectify two different systems that act as sources of truth for different things. In this case, ArchivesSpace for metadata and Preservica for digital assets. To keep them both useful, ArchivesSpace needs to be able to persistently and accurately link out to where digital objects are stored, and Preservica needs to be able to persistently and accurately describe the resources that it stores. The answer is to programmatically link these two platforms so that they can stay in sync over time and communicate with each other bidirectionally. Luckily, Preservica has built an extension to their software using the ArchivesSpace API that allows this functionality. It imports ArchivesSpace EAD as metadata into Preservica, creates a digital object in ArchivesSpace, and then keeps both of these up to date over time. The issue is that creating the submission information packages, or SIPs, in such a way that Preservica can both properly ingest them and successfully link them up to ArchivesSpace is like pretty challenging to do manually. I struggled in formulating this talk because it is very easy to go down a series of rabbit holes related to the hierarchical ArchivesSpace data model, EAD's metadata schema, Preservica's PAX data model, and its associated OPEX metadata schema. It all ends up being way more than can feasibly get crammed into a conference session. So the focus here is an overview of what those SIPs need to look like, how they relate to both systems in play, and the solution I've come up with to try and make this process easier. For those comfortable doing some coding, I've got both a Python script library, and for those who aren't, I've created a little graphical utility for the Windows users out there that enables the creation of these SIPs with a handful of button clicks. Finally, a word about dependencies. This currently requires the Digitization Work Order Plugin created by NYU to be installed and used in ArchivesSpace. We were able to have Lyrasis install this for us without issue, but I do realize this might complicate things for folks. So that everyone has an idea of what the desired end state of all of this is, I've got a couple of screenshots here showing a successfully synced collection. On the right-hand side, we have a snippet of the finding aid structure in the ArchivesSpace PY, showing a collection, series, and subseries, along with individual items. On the left, we have a view inside Preservica, whereby you can see that the finding aid hierarchy and structure have been replicated as a series of nested folders. There are differences, such as Preservica only brings over the title itself and not the constructed title that includes the date, for instance. Also, it sorts everything in alphabetical order rather than in what order you have decided in your ArchivesSpace finding aid. Also, talking about data models, everything that is an archival object in ArchivesSpace becomes a folder in Preservica. However, both Preservica folders and assets can become digital objects in ArchivesSpace. This ends up being kind of weird with collections described at the item level because those items end up being folders with precisely one asset in them, the folder representing the archival object, the asset corresponding to the digital object. Okay, so that's the desired endpoint, but let's jump back to the beginning. On the left, we have circled in red where you can actually find the option to generate a digitization work order once that NYU plugin has been installed. This shows up in the More menu when you navigate to a collection record, though it's always a little bit cut off in the browser for me. On the right, we have the interface for the plugin. Here you can very granularly select precisely which elements you'd like included in the work order. If you uncheck a series or subseries, everything included in that portion of the hierarchy is then also excluded. You have the option to generate a report, which just outputs a bunch of data from ArchivesSpace generate a work order, which takes the extra step of assigning a value to the component identifier field in ArchivesSpace. And this exports as a TSV file, a tab separated values file, but that's pretty easy to import into Excel and turn into a standard Excel workbook or a CSV file or anything else you might want. We've got a couple of screenshots of snippets from the output of the Digitization Work Order plugin that we were looking at in the previous screen. It can export a whole host of data, but I've only included on the screen what we'll need for our purposes. This includes the ref ID identifier that ArchivesSpace assigns to all resources, the URI, which I'll generally refer to as the archival object number, as that is what we care about from that column, the resource title, the component ID or CUID, and more on that in just a second, and any associated dates. The CUID isn't mandatory in this process, but one of the things that we've been working on at UR is overhauling our file naming practices to try to make them as consistent and, really importantly, as durable as possible. To that end, the work order plugin can automatically assign these CUIDs to records, which we then use in the resulting file names to create the strong connection between the files and the metadata to make sure they can be contextualized over time. So here we are just looking at a simple screen grab from inside Windows Explorer. For the purpose of this talk, we're not focusing on the workflow if you were writing a bunch of Python scripts, but instead on if you were using the graphical utility that hopefully might make folks' lives easier. This is our before state, where we have a folder that has our digitization work order with all the great data we discussed in the previous slide, as well as all the associated archival master images as single-page TIFFs and the access copies of the assets as multi-page PDFs. And these just all get dumped into one folder together. I would like to insert my usual disclaimer at this point. I am but a librarian who eventually ran into a spreadsheet project that I just couldn't do manually, so I finally broke down and learned Python. But what I'm not is a software developer. Please bear that in mind. Furthermore, I realize this utility is not going to be winning any beauty prizes, but the next few slides will go over briefly the functionality of the graphical utility, descriptively called the PAX OPEX utility, or what I'm now simply calling Chimera. One version of the mythological creature is described as having aspects of a snake, a lion, and a goat, so it felt appropriate. The snake representing the Python code that enables the utility, but I'll leave it as an exercise for the listener to determine whether Preservica or ArchivesSpace ends up being the regal lion or the ornery goat in the scenario, probably based on whichever system is giving you more issues at the moment. Anyways, Chimera has an interactive panel on the left and an output screen on the right. This pre-ingest tab is where you set up your SIP generation action. You can specify where the folder that we saw in the previous slide is located and specify where the work order spreadsheet is located and how many rows have data that we care about. There are some basic customization options as well, where you can specify which file extension represents your preservation or access assets, so PDF for access, TIFF for preservation. You can opt to have Chimera take the ISO 8601 formatted dates from the work order spreadsheet and convert them into conventionally formatted dates in like a month, day, year convention, and then concatenate those with the title. And you can specify what the character is that separates your consistent file name prefix from the sequence number typically at the end of a file name that lets you distinguish page numbers. Final note, you can opt to generate a file manifest for quality control purposes. This just ends up being a CSV file with one column full of file names and a second column full of corresponding checksums, either MD5 or SHA-1. You can then use this to make sure nothing gets corrupted in transit to Preservica afterwards by comparing the files and file names and checksums that you have locally in this CSV file with what Preservica is then feeding you back after ingest. Once you transfer your SIPs into Preservica, the linking process doesn't happen automatically. There are some additional tasks to shift the content into an appropriate folder, and then a workflow is executed to create the initial link with ArchivesSpace. Chimera has some quality of life functions to help try and make this process a little easier in the post-ingest tab. So long as your Preservica account is an administrator, you can use your credentials to move assets from one folder to another. This is also where you can locate the relevant file manifest to do that aforementioned quality control. Long-term, I really like the idea of turning Chimera into sort of a workbench where you can do all sorts of useful things that either ArchivesSpace or Preservica doesn't do out of the box. In the last Utilities tab, there is one example of what this could look like. Here you can enter the identifier for a given folder in Preservica, and it will output how many assets and files are contained in the folder, as well as how much storage that folder takes up. This information can be useful in populating out an extent field in ArchivesSpace, for instance, to provide context of the nature of your digital assets back into the finding aid. Okay. So rather than trying to do a live demo, I've recorded a quick video of Chimera in action. The output panel on the right shows what it is doing at every step of the way, because there are quite a few steps under the hood involved in creating the SIPs. The idea here is that if this blows up for you, copy the contents of the output panel into a text file and send it to me, and hopefully I'll be able to figure out what went wrong and how to fix Chimera up as a result. Some other things to note is that a lot of these options in Chimera can be saved in a little JSON file that sits in wherever you store the program on your computer. Underneath the output panel, hitting the Save button will record all these options into the JSON file, and then Display will output all the values in the screen above. As a result, though, if you opt to save your password and two-factor token, that becomes sort of a security issue because the JSON file is just plain text, but there's nothing saying you have to. It's just for convenience sake. The Help button will display documentation on whatever tab you are currently on. The Clear button will wipe the output panel clean, and the About button shows software version number, last updated date, and my contact information. Exit is pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so here we finally have the after state, a job that has successfully been run through Chimera. At the top, we have a folder labeled container with the date and time the job was run to help provide a little extra context. That should be able to be just dragged and dropped in such a way that Preservica's OPEX incremental ingest will do all the work of the actual ingest. The file right below the container file, but named identically, is actually that file manifest CSV that's used for quality control. So that won't go over to Preservica. Finally, we've got the original digitization work order sitting right where it has been the entire time. So when you run all of this, it takes those folders, or it takes all of those assets we saw in the before state, and then creates this folder structure and navigates everything to where it needs to be. Inside the container folder, we have individual folders representing discrete archival objects, plus a metadata file for the container folder. Inside each of these archival objects, we have a zipped digital object package containing all the asset files, those PDFs and TIFFs, plus a metadata file describing it. And then in each folder of the hierarchy, we also have a metadata file that's describing the folder itself. Just kind of in general, metadata for folders lives inside of the folder it is describing. Metadata for assets or digital objects sits next to that digital object, and everything is kind of named similarly to match them up. Okay, so starting to look at the actual metadata. This is all of the OPEX metadata that is a schema particular to Preservica. Let's look at those metadata for one of those zip digital objects. We're not going to look at everything here, but the things circled in red call out data that was pulled from our digitization work order. We've got the title that was then combined with the converted ISO 8601 date that were both present in the spreadsheet to create the title for Preservica. The ArchivesSpace ref ID is also present here, as the syncing process requires a unique identifier, and the identifier from ArchivesSpace seems like a great way to satisfy this need. And you can also see a checksum was generated for the whole zip file, which Preservica compares against during its ingest process, adding another layer of quality control. Here we have the metadata for the archival object folder containing the digital asset and its metadata. There's not a ton to see here other than noting that it is using the archival object number from the URI column of the work order spreadsheet. Both of these also have little descriptive metadata snippets that are needed for syncing with Preservica, but aren't anything we really need to get into here. They never change, they're always consistent. They just need to be present in the metadata files. Finally, let's see what this actually looks like in Preservica and in ArchivesSpace at the end of this very long journey. So this is a view of an individual asset within Preservica, where you can now see a lot of the elements in previous screenshots represented in the system itself, such as the constructed title at the top, a slew of metadata, or a slew of identifiers in the center, and a preview of the asset itself. We're in the middle of a big project, a migration project from Islandora over to Preservica. So we are bringing all sorts of metadata along for the ride, including Dublin core and mods. We're generating new premise preservation metadata records. But however, crucially here, you can see the imported EAD from ArchivesSpace, which is what we care about. If anything about this metadata changes in ArchivesSpace, a nightly job that Preservica runs will check for changes and then pull them over automatically. This is again to stress that for descriptive metadata, Preservica is not the source of truth, but instead of ArchivesSpace is. This metadata doesn't look particularly clean, however. Metadata display is one next big area for us to tackle now that a key position has been filled at my institution in our metadata services department. This just shows the data model in Preservica, so you can see how those TIFF images have been declared preservation representations, while the PDF is the access representation. This has downstream effects for where content is stored and how it can be accessed, but not super important for our purposes. And now let's switch over to ArchivesSpace. So you can see the archival object here in the finding aid. Nothing much to see out of the ordinary, other than to note that the component unique identifier is present, where it previously was not before we generated that work order using the NYU plugin. And yeah, that's it. And then let's switch over to the digital object, which is a little bit more interesting for our purposes. So this is the digital object that was connected to and attached to the previous archival object we just saw. And this was automatically created by Preservica as part of the syncing process. Required no manual work whatsoever. The file version section then provides links out to the administrative backend of Preservica, as well as to the Preservica public user interface, if that is in use at your org. And that kind of wraps up. I hope this was at all useful to you all. I've got the GitHub links to both the raw script library as well as to where you can actually download Chimera. Some limitations to note briefly are that Chimera assumes that your finding aid is subscribed to the item level. I realize that is a massive assumption, and that we're all dealing with huge backlogs, and the idea of getting all of our finding aids to the item level is a massive lift. But something I'm hoping to tackle over the next year is to build out some additional functionality so that Chimera can handle multiple characterizations of finding aids, such as ingesting at the series or the collection level, to try and make this a little bit more verbose in its applications. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you here. And if you have any questions about any of this, truly don't hesitate to reach out. I'd love to chat with you about this work. And I think we've got plenty of time. So if folks have questions, I would love to answer them. And sorry, I have not been monitoring the chat or the Q&A.
That's fine, John. Thank you so much. Yeah, but first off, we've gotten a thank you for the cat, so I'll go ahead and acknowledge that before we move to the question. But the first question is from Brian. For item tilting, did you consider using a computer readable date at the front end of the title? For item titling, sorry. Did you consider using a computer readable date at the front of the title for system sorting to be date ordered?
Oh, that's interesting. No, you see, this is where I kind of admit also that I'm not an archivist. I am a digital librarian sort of person. So all of the practice that I saw in our finding aids was title concatenated with human readable date. So I just assumed that was best practice. But that is an interesting idea. That could be a cool enhancement. Thank you very much for that idea. I'll write that down.
Brian also asks, are you also using the hierarchy modification part of the plugin that will rearrange the items folders if the ArchivesSpace hierarchy changes?
Yes, I believe so. Yeah, that is my understanding. Yeah.
Thanks. All right. We do have plenty of time for questions. If you have any questions, please do drop them into the Q&A. I'm speaking slowly.
Just navigate back to the links if anybody wants to jot those down or anything. Also, I threw all of this up into our institutional repository at UR. So I know that this is going to be recorded and on the ASpace website as well. So all this stuff is available. Shoot me an email and I can send you the link.
Yeah, thanks. All right, we do have another question from Crystal. Is this your process on a go forward basis as well as for your backlog?
Yeah. So yes. Well, actually, could you talk a little bit more about that? Our process in terms of describing everything at the item level?
I think Crystal, please chime in with clarification, but I'm going to make one up. The idea that this was you dealing with a backlog or as a large project. Is this going to be, are you going to use the same workflow going forward for all of your materials?
Oh, gotcha. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So this originally kind of spun out of a script library that I built specifically to migrate from Islandora to Preservica. And then I ended up sort of just building it out as kind of starting from scratch. You have a researcher come in and say, I want big swaths of this collection digitized and made available to me. So then you can use the NYU plugin for what it was originally, the original purpose of it, which was to create digitization work orders for your lab, so that they could then take that, digitize all of the stuff, and then build out the finding aid as a result afterwards to kind of get some of that data to go back into the finding aid. So this is our general purpose workflow going forward. Though again, I actually just finished the first couple ingests that we've done at the series level instead of the item level. So now I'm trying to figure out how I need to get that to be reflected in the graphical utility as well.
Thanks. Kayla asks, have you been told or do you know if the new data model portal in Preservica will affect your process?
I don't, God, I really hope not. Boy, I really hope not.
Write that down, yeah.
Yeah. So we're lucky that we don't have a huge development team at my institution, but we do have some resources there. So we're using the WordPress-based universal access front end, the kind of the Preservica PY, rather than the new portal, because we want to have that sort of customization options. And we haven't run into any issues with that so far, because my understanding at least is that the data model should stay consistent enough that it is able to be reflected in the new portal as well without issue. Though I'm sure now that I've said that, I'm probably utterly wrong about it. Preservica is hard to keep up to date with from like a professional development perspective.
Thanks. Another question in the Q&A. I know you mentioned the workflow is dependent on the NYU plugin. Is there a world where this application can be used without the need for this plugin? I imagine the need to get this to work without the plugin might be difficult.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So one of the things that I'd like to, really all we need is like a few sort of like values for every record or series or whatever to somehow be fed into this graphical utility. You know, things like title, things like dates, things like the ArchivesSpace ref ID, that sort of thing. So long as they are being fed in like some kind of spreadsheet form, like whether that's a TSV or a CSV or a workbook, or whether the NYU plugin is generating it or not, that's kind of all we really need. So that's one of the things that I'd like to enhance, is just to say, like, you know, to be able to specify, like, here is, you know, the data input, here's where you can find the different things in the different columns, and then let the utility kind of just take it from there. So that's one of the enhancements I'm hoping to do over the summer. Also, speaking of enhancements, this whole thing, the whole graphical utility, is built on this Python library called PySimpleGUI, which just rug pulled everybody it was previously freely accessible, and now they're charging for access. So another summer project is going to be to rebuild it using a different graphical interface. So that mostly just to say, if you download it in like the next couple of weeks and see that the styling of it changes over the summer, that will be the reason why. But of course, nothing is ever consistent.
Thanks. The next question was from Brian asking if you use PySimpleGUI. So I guess that was why that was asked, and now we know the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another question, could you describe again the item folder asset incongruity between the systems that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk? I'm not sure I understood.
Item folder I'm gonna apologize. I'm gonna back up through the slides a bunch to see if I think I know what you're talking about. Okay, so is this kind of referring to kind of the folders and assets in Preservica versus archival objects and digital objects in ArchivesSpace?
Yes, that part.
Okay. So an archival object will always become a folder in Preservica, but the inverse isn't always true. So you can have digital objects in ArchivesSpace represent either folders. So for instance, for something like a series level ingest, or a digital object straight up representing an asset in Preservica, like an atomic actual record in Preservica. But how that actually plays out is just the difference between a series level and an item level ingest for how you're getting stuff into Preservica, in my experience. So, which is mostly just to say that this is a little bit more customizable for the general syncing process in general, kind of different from what the utilities, what Chimera is actually able to do, which is only at the item level currently, just because of the limitations of the code, which I hope answers your question.
Thanks. If it doesn't, please follow up.
Yeah.
All right. There's no other questions in the Q&A right now. We'll give it another minute. Megan says thanks. So I hope that answered.
Oh, just responding to Corey in the chat. Yeah, that's also my experience. I'm like being very careful not to update PySimple GUI to version 5 so that it doesn't break. I think I'm going to use one of the underlying frameworks, Tkinter, which I think is firmly open source and won't get pulled. But anyways, that's just a little bit about the Python stuff underneath.
All right. Not seeing any other questions in the Q&A, though it sounds like there's plenty of discussion happening in the chat about this. So we'll go ahead and say thank you very much. Thank you to John. This was great. Lots of good cat references and overall nerdy stuff. So I really appreciate it. We enjoyed it. Feel free to go ahead and stop sharing your screen. And then we have our last presentation of the day is